Hey everyone, I felt like this was a really good lecture to include to kind of get us oriented into funding for any number of organizations you may work for in the future and really think about how this comes together to ultimately provide our livelihood, right? Where do our organizations get money? How do we make money? And understanding the financial environment, or what we call the funding environment for a company or organization, is actually really critical to understanding that organization and becoming a major player in that organization. So first, let's begin with our funding sources. So funding for your organization, whether it be a law firm, a police department, a private therapy clinic, a school, a safe house, a nonprofit, a hospital, or a jail, is dependent on funding that comes from a variety of sources. So first we have the taxpayer, right? Property tax, sales tax, etc. We also have clients or customer profit, right? Those are like the big ones for corporate. You have donations or investment revenue that comes in. You certainly have federal or state government allocations. Insurance companies also provide funding for some of these kinds of companies. And then you have things that are, court fees, penalties, or judgments that come in the form of lawsuits or speeding tickets or fees just collected because of services. So we don't really call them revenue, but they're more kind of a fee structure. So these are kind of the main ways for the employers that we are targeting in this class. This is where their funding is coming from, but let's talk about some of these one by one so we can really wrap our head around it. So first, we're going to jump into the world of taxes. So this is kind of this humongous world, and it's kind of scary, and right, we always talk about there's two only guaranteed things in life: death and taxes, that you will go through at some point in your life, and yes, you will. We all often forget the kinds of things that taxes do for us, so that we can better understand the structure. Let's start with federal taxes. So federal taxes are a big part of our lives. The federal government gets 50% of its revenue from individual income taxes, or at least $3.5 trillion a year. So 50%, that's a lot. Now, that's not the only source of income for the federal government. It also gets corporate income tax. They get payroll taxes. We call it social insurance tax. That's where our Social Security and Medicare payments come from, is payroll taxes. You also get excise taxes and then other forms of taxation, picking up the rest. So this is why taxation is such a big discussion politically, is because it's such an important revenue stream for the federal government. That's a lot of money, $3.5 trillion on average per year that comes in from us. But let's look at this in terms of total share, okay? So these are the sources of federal revenue over time. So this is from 1950 to almost 2020, right? So we have about what? Almost 70 years of taxation. And these little colored areas, these shaded areas on this graph, kind of show you over time, we've relatively been stable when it comes to individual income tax, with some years of spikes and some years of drops, but it's been pretty consistent between 45 to 50% of the revenue coming into the federal government. We can also see that in the 50s and 60s and 70s, corporate income tax was a lot higher than it is today, and it's kind of come back and forth between the 90s and then the 2000s, and it's kind of gone all up and down. So that's under discussion politically. And then also social insurance or payroll tax. Look how that has greatly increased. And a big part of that has to do with the workforce, how many people are in the workforce, how many people we can apply payroll taxes to, and then certainly retirees, the aging demographic of our country, and the need to support retirees through social insurance programs. So that's become an increasing share of sources of federal revenue. Okay, and then certainly excise tax, not so much, not as big of a player, and then other taxes. Okay, so these are kind of, again, why we discuss taxes the way we do. Politically, you can kind of see how this plays out. Then we get into state taxes. So state government gets about 30% of its revenue from government transfers and about 23% from sales tax. And the sales tax part, that's $352 billion a year. So you can say that state taxes are much more spread out. They get into things like charges and miscellaneous fees, and they also do have individual income tax revenues. Not all states have an income tax, but many do, and they get a little chunk from that. And then certainly you have corporate income taxes and other taxes that vary state to state. So this is where the state gets its money from, and some people don't really take the time to go through where their funding sources are and why having major companies come in that pay great big corporate income taxes are a big deal to a county or a state or a city, because they're actively competing for taxation revenue for that company, for their area, because that's one of the very limited ways they can get revenue. So that's why you see states competing for headquarters of Amazon and some of these kinds of things, because that's one way they can increase their revenue. Here's the breakdown. Again, this is much more consistent. The intergovernmental transfers. So these are things, like, taxes unique to counties or states or federal government that kind of shuffling hands, or the money gets shuffled around. And these can be things, like stimulus packages, rebates and refunds, and all kinds of stuff. And certainly grants are a part of this too. So intergovernmental transfers, sales tax, individual income tax, corporate, other taxes, and then charges and miscellaneous. Every state kind of plays with this a little bit, but you can see the shares are actually pretty even as far as how their breakdown goes and their general revenue for a state. So hopefully this was useful, giving you a sense of kind of how federal taxes come in, how state taxes come in, and kind of why they matter. Let's jump into profits. Okay, so now we're getting into the corporate side. There are some of you that might go more corporate or into a private firm rather than nonprofit or government. So I always like to spend a little bit of time covering this. So first, we talk about things like gross domestic product. We talk about GDP. You also have gross metropolitan product, right? Areas or cities that tend to have a lot of revenue generation. In 2019, corporations in the U.S. made profits of around 2.25 trillion U.S. dollars per year. But our gross domestic product of the United States, all of our economic activity and output, is about $21.4 trillion, which is the largest in the world, and a lot of countries have trouble keeping up. So we are kind of an economic powerhouse. What happens to the U.S. tends to affect all other countries equally challenged by that. It actually grows, our GDP grows by an average of 2.3% per year, or about $492 billion each year. It's hard for me to kind of equate trillions to billions, but that's essentially the growth that we see. So these are the kind of corporate profits. So right when you were thinking, wow, we take in $3.5 trillion in taxes every year, well, we also have corporate profits of $2.25 trillion and a gross domestic product of $21 trillion. So we're still doing pretty good. These are the cities in 2020 that basically are having some of the most production as far as economic output and efficiency. So we have New York and Newark, New Jersey, Los Angeles and Long Beach, Anaheim, Chicago, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Philadelphia, Boston, Atlanta, Seattle, Miami, San Jose, and Phoenix. Those are kind of our great big metropolitan areas that are seeing a lot of economic activity. And certainly there are others, but these are kind of the heavy hitters for now. So if you're looking for that big city that's doing a lot of revenue generation, as far as profits are concerned, these are the ones you want to keep your eye on. And then certainly if you want to look internationally, this is kind of what GDP looks like globally. So these are kind of the countries. We often refer to them as the G8. These are the most developed, kind of highest economically producing countries in the world. So there's the United States at the top of the list, followed by China, Japan, Germany, India, the UK, France, Italy, Canada, Korea, Russia, Brazil, Australia, Spain, Indonesia, Mexico, and the Netherlands. So these countries are the ones that are kind of calling the shots for who gets a seat at the global economic table, are these countries here. When we look at individual companies, the 10 most profitable companies in 2020 in the United States are Apple, Microsoft, Berkshire Hathaway. You may have heard of the name Warren Buffett. That is his company. Alphabet, they run Google. Intel, Facebook, Johnson & Johnson, Verizon, Pfizer, and Walmart. And some of these ones at the bottom of the top 10 list are kind of obvious, especially as we're navigating through a pandemic. And we certainly are dealing with a lot of personal shopping and vaccine development, right? And telecom, right? So it's things we can do from home, things we can do to get past the pandemic. So it kind of makes sense to us. But let's talk a little bit bigger. Highest revenue companies in 2020 in the world. So this is the top 20 list. What you see a pattern here, and it's fun to look at these over time as far as where they get their funding from and what they're producing and what revenues are coming out. So number one, you have Walmart. You have a lot of Chinese and Saudi petroleum companies after that. State Grid is actually an energy company for China. Royal Dutch Shell is an oil and gas company. Then you have some car makers. You have Toyota. You have another oil and gas company, BP, Volkswagen, ExxonMobil. So these kind of make sense to us. These are big global companies. And then there's Apple. You have Berkshire Hathaway again, Amazon, United Health Group. So now we're starting to get into electronics, communications, healthcare. Glencore, that is a mining and energy company. McKesson is also healthcare. Daimler is an auto company. CVS Health and Total, which is another oil and gas company. So again, we're seeing a lot of activity in energy production, healthcare, electronics, and cars. Those are big ticket items for countries, cities, states, individuals to buy. A lot of activity going on there. So I thought this would be kind of useful to look at taxes and profit. Those are kind of the big pieces that come in. But this is also my challenge to you when you're thinking about your organization you're going to work for, and thinking about how they do things. I always encourage students to diversify their funding sources. So these would be the questions that you want to ask your organization. So where is money available that our organization underutilizes, right? So is there money that's not really being tapped? How can we expand our resource pool? Where or who can I partner and collaborate with? Maybe pooling your funds together to be able to get more bang for your buck. And is there free labor available? Volunteers or people that maybe need training opportunities or experience that would give you their work, right? So there are all kinds of ways to diversify our funding sources. And sometimes it's not necessarily dollars. It might be resources. It might be connections, or it might be labor costs. So be creative in thinking about how you're getting some gains for your organization. But with this, we're going to kind of segue into fundraising. So when we talk about fundraising, this happens in a lot of ways. And you could do a whole class, it's all 16 weeks on just fundraising. And if you're interested in working in the nonprofit sector and the government sector specifically, you really need to take some classes or sign up for some workshops on fundraising. It is a matter of time before that's going to come across your path. So it's really important to learn more about this area of philanthropy. So fundraising, these are some ideas and things to consider when you're trying to brainstorm ways for your organization to get some funding. So you can do annual fund campaigns where you kind of do fundraising on a yearly basis. These used to happen kind of in the forms of telethons and annual fundraising events. You see them on public TV stations and so forth, but there's so much more than that. Every major organization or nonprofit has an annual fund where they can kind of get dollars year round. And a lot of these dollars are coming in online, right? There also are monthly giving programs, things like auto debits. So maybe you don't want to ask for a lump sum from somebody like $120 a year. Maybe you can ask for $10 a month over 12 months, and that's how you can get that $120. So this can be political campaigns, it can be big universities, it can be foundations that support victims of crimes. It can be, first responder surviving families that have been killed in the line of duty, all kinds of things. So you have to think about, what is the last fundraising you participated in, or maybe the last fundraising you ran. Those are things you want to put on your resume too, by the way, the ones that you run, because there are skill sets that come with being a fundraiser. Online fundraising is a really big deal, and I tell people, consider providing swag, right? That's kind of a funny term, stuff we all get, kind of those freebies, pins, wearables, t-shirts and exclusive items, perks, or maybe access to people that in the form of talks or events. So people often will provide you money if they get cool stuff, right? They get some kind of thing that lets them wear it or show their support or dangle it on their social media, or they get access to something special that they don't get all the time. You can certainly do fundraising in the form of events. You can do virtual 5K races, right? Those are really fun to do. I participate in many of them myself. You can provide options to fundraise on top of a registration fee, right? So you kind of add a little place to say, here's your registration fee for the event. Would you like to also contribute $1 or $5? And you'd be surprised at how many fundraising dollars come in through that. You can use competitions like a mustache or a beard growing contest. You can do a video game tournament, a dance marathon, shave your head goals, using viral videos. There are all kinds of goofy, funny ways to see funny videos, and you'd be surprised at what people will pay for. You can fundraise for the big moments and amazing milestones, things like anniversaries, memorials, commemorations. Certainly those are very emotional things for people, and that often comes in the form of remembering or tributing. So think about the ways that your organization has these milestones. Maybe it's celebrating its birthday. Maybe you have an achievement or a milestone that you want to highlight as kind of a cornerstone achievement, and a way to remember some success. You can also provide a year-round fundraising option on your website, just keeping a place for money to go. You'd be surprised at how many people don't do that, or it's really buried and hard to find. And if you make a donor work too hard, they're just not going to donate. So forget that. Fundraising will continue just in this next slide here, using major gifts as a way to create a matching gift campaign by pooling funds together. So you may have a donor that says, okay, I want to give you $40,000. That's a pretty big gift, right? I don't see $40,000 all the time. So they want to give you $40,000, and you say, actually, why don't we have you give us 20? And then we'll do a matching gift campaign, and we'll use the other 20 this way. So you can say, hey, I will match gifts by other people up to $10,000. So, you'll match gifts, and you'll kind of be able to use that 40 in a different way, and then maybe go above and beyond by people giving a little more. So maybe you get the 40,000, you do some matching contributions, and you end up with closer to maybe 60,000. So there are lots of ways to do that. And donors really like doing it because it gives them notoriety and publicity of being charitable and generous, and it gives them that kind of high level exposure, which a lot of them like for their organizations or families. You can also make strategic partnerships or sponsors who are like-minded, right? Define how your partnership would be mutually beneficial, driving missions of both organizations forward. So you have to kind of find groups that are like you, and instead of competing with each other, maybe you join forces. Be sure you have mobile devices ready for cashless contributions on the go, as well as fundraising software that uses what we call responsive design, which adapts to any screen size. You'd be surprised at how many people just want to whip out their phone and make a donation easily using, something like Apple Pay, right? And if they can't quite get after your donation, your online financial app, and you make it hard for them, again, they're not going to like it. And certainly there are organizations like Amazon Smile that will give percents back to certain nonprofits. If you have people list you as a nonprofit or a school or a hospital, then you can have them use their Amazon Smile donations for your organization. And that's just money that's out there anyway. It's just steering it to your organization. So again, we're just skimming the surface with fundraising, but these are all kinds of things to consider when you think about fundraising at a low level or even at a high level. But let's get into grants, right? This is kind of what we're heading into as we wrap up this semester. So when we talk about grants, I'm going to come back to this again and again. What is a definition of a grant? So a grant is a gift of money from an organization, foundation, or government entity, not an individual donor. Now, it can be a donor that funds the grant, but the grant usually comes from an organization that administers it, okay? That does not have to be repaid, right? There's no interest on it. You don't have to give money back. It's a gift. Grants are given to various organizations for such costs as administrative costs, labor, programs, capital purchases, equipment, buildings, real estate, enhancing capacity or training, rehabilitation, product development, and research. So you have all kinds of ways that grants are used for organizations where you're actually buying things, or you're supporting people, or creating programs. I mean, it's pretty endless, the possibilities of grants. So then on the other side of the grant is a funder. So a funder is that organization, right? The person that's giving the grant. So that's something to keep track of as well. And that could be a nonprofit, it could be government, you name it. Funding with grants, just a little bit of experience then and now, right? So I'm starting to get into some of what we're headed toward in the Karsh and Fox text. But funding with grants, in today's financial climate, funders are often sought to pick up the budget shortfalls of difficult times. And grants are one way of soliciting money for your organization. However, especially in difficult economic times, kind of all boats sink and all boats float, right? So they impact all of us. So we have to kind of consider that sometimes grants and competition is going to get a lot tighter. In past times, organization could get regular funds for doing good work or even out of empathy, but this has really been replaced by what we call evidence-based decision-making, or EBDM. And you've probably heard of this a little bit before, but essentially it's a process for making decisions beyond intuition or instinct by using the available evidence to rely on data and facts for the best possible outcomes. So it's really letting the science, the data, the analysis drive the result, okay? And we used to call this armchair thinking or gut thinking, and we just don't do that anymore. There's a lot of uncertainty that comes with that, and so that's just not the name of the game anymore. So evidence-based thinking or evidence-based decision-making is essentially focusing on information from these sources. So these are kind of the guiding sources of where we start to get our evidence from. And this goes right into the critical thinking module that we talked about. So it goes against the elements of thought about information, right? You're getting all the relevant information that is relevant, significant, that provides you breadth and depth, right? So this is the way we go about doing that. So first we have empirical studies from academic journals, and we call that what the science says. You have internal company data, what's happening within your organization. You have professional expertise from practitioners, what your peers' experiences are, values and concerns of stakeholders, and the feedback of those affected. So you have to take all of those things into consideration before you make your decision, because they're going to guide you into kind of a best practice, showing that this decision has been carefully analyzed and thought out and planned. Okay, so wrapping up here, evidence-based decision-making, this is kind of the name of the game with grants. So you have to really make sure you get into this mindset so that you can be a competitive applicant for a grant if this is going to be a way you fund your organization. So evidence-based decision-making sources must be evaluated for quality before using. So I tell students, don't just pick the first return on a Google search. Don't just pick the first journal article that happens to line up with your topic or your area. Find the good science. Not everything that's published is good, is quality. And you're going to have to kind of do a thorough search to kind of get that saturation point where you're seeing kind of all evidence kind of pointing a certain direction and you're getting common feedback. So I tell people, first gather evidence, and these are skills you've learned in this major, right? Doing literature reviews, obtaining your data, connecting with peers, gathering feedback. So knowing where to look and what is a good source of the science. That is a huge part of the skills you learn in sociology and criminology. And then certainly you have to interpret the evidence. So once you get all that information, then you have to analyze it and identify trends that are going to guide you in your decision. And we teach you analysis skills in this major as well to talk about, what is this all saying? What is the bottom line? What does it tell us? So this is the report part after you get the information. And then finally, you need to apply what you've learned, discuss and conclude so that it's very clear based on the information that came in, the analysis provided. Now there should be a very obvious way forward of what the next step is and how to go about it. What is the action? What is the program? What is the approach? What is the strategy? So again, this is just kind of rounding out the way you want to start thinking about grants, the way you want to start thinking about funding. Again, remembering that funding comes from a lot of different places and to be able to kind of orient yourself to that. But we'll be going in more deeply into grants and into grant applications and nonprofits in future lectures. So hopefully this got your feet wet, and we'll see you next time.